all right, I'll just tell Katie, and then there's 35 past already. Oh, no, I can do that.
Oh, that's the how to cover. So I don't know.
Yep.
There's our timetable, which I don't know if
Yep.
there's one in there.
Cool. All right. Hello. Can everyone hear me? Hello. Hey. Yep. I'll just stand here for a sec. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back. So this is the continuation series. So I'll just hand out some notes because John's kindly provided us some new notes. So I'll just give you all these. So these are from Genesis 12. Oh, you already got some, did you? Oh, sorry.
Filed already.
All right, excellent. Did you get any? So these are the new ones. Got some for you. I'm assuming, John, you've already got some? Yeah, that's always the way. What do you have on? So I'll have to remember to grab myself some. So basically, in the series up until now was Genesis 1 through to chapter 11. And so here we're continuing from the end of chapter 11 of Genesis and forward, basically through to the end of the chapter, end of the book. So we're going to be looking at Abraham, the man Abram, who was changed to Abraham, and also some of the promises to him and his descendants and the people that came from them. So it's a really interesting section of Genesis. It's quite a shift in the focus in the book from Genesis 11. I think I said the other week, sort of Genesis 1 through to 6 has actually covered a lot of time in a very short period, a couple of chapters, whereas here it's a lot more detail about an individual's life and what they did and what they said and their day-to-day life in some aspects. But if you'll just bow your heads, we'll just start with a word of prayer as well. Dear God in heaven above, we come to you at the beginning of our evening together. We praise your name, and we are truly thankful that you have provided us with your word. You have left on record your word, your plan, and your purpose. That we can read it, we can learn about you, we can learn about your character and your thoughts, and hopefully we can learn and apply these things into our lives. It gives us a great deal of faith that we're able to see these things and look back at creation. We're able to look at your plan that you've set out from that time forward. We do pray you be with us tonight, and so we come to you now through your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. So tonight, Ern's going to be taking us through, it says here in the program, Abraham, a background. So overview of Abraham and his life. And then I'll come in after that and talk about from end of chapter 11 and through to 13. So hand over to Ern now. Thank you.
I'm going to grab myself something to drink as I go.
Sit there.
That's now all you've got now, sorry. Right, so good evening everybody. Last week we finished off with the Tower of Babel, the dispersion of the nations, from a history point of view. And before that we mentioned about Noah, the man that built the ark and was saved. So I thought from the last week's notes actually, the notes we're using before, we'd look at the sons of Noah. There was, it's commonly said Shem, Ham and Japheth, but the order of the names is Japheth the older, and then there's Shem and Ham. And to work out that Shem was the second son, you can look at those two quotes, Genesis 10:21 and 9 verse 24. But I'm not going to read them at the moment, but so I've put him in the middle. Now then I've just made out a chart here. There's a set of numbers, goes down the edge, which is the time in years from the flood, which I thought would be of interest, seeing that we looked at it. And then I make a note, the flood was about 1,650 years from creation. So just to give us some idea. from creation to Christ is about 4,000 years. So we're looking, 2,350 years BC. So it says that a man, Arphaxad, was born 2 years after the flood to Shem. So what we've got down here is the line of Shem. Little interesting side issue. It's not really a side issue, I suppose. The nations we call Semitic, and at the moment, every now and again it hits the news about anti-Semitism. That normally applies to the Jews, but technically it applies to Jews and Arabs. But these days it's virtually only applied to the Jews. You don't hear much about the Arabs being Semitic because politically there's been a bit of distancing going on over the last 50-odd years. So anyway, from the line of Shem we go Arphaxad, Salah, or as it's shown in Chronicles, Shelah, Eber, Peleg. Now a little bit about Eber. The Jewish people speak a language called Hebrew. And the basic Hebrew word for Eber is very similar to the word Hebrew. And so whether the name Hebrew came from Eber or, and I'm going to say this right up the front, the word Hebrew means to change or to cross over. And a lot of people, and I always thought, that Abraham was called the Hebrew because he crossed over he crossed over the River Jordan. He came from the east and crossed over into Israel and then went down into Egypt. And so he became known as Abram the Hebrew. But it could also mean he's a descendant of Eber. Eber had a son called Peleg, and it mentions when this hereditary line is brought up, that at that time the world was divided. In other words, that's the time of Babel, the Tower of Babel, and God confusing the languages and people going off and dispersing from that point because of what language they spoke. Then there's Ru, Serug, Nahor and Terah. Now, here's an interesting point. Noah, it says, lived 350 years after the flood. And we're told that Terah's son Abraham was born approximately 352 years after the flood. Now, I got all these numbers by adding up the ages that we're given in Genesis, now where is it? Genesis 11, from about verse 11 down to about verse 26, 27. And it gives a list of ages. He was so old when he had this son and then lived for so many years. So whether there's a bit of overlap or something, I don't know, but technically Noah dies around the time that Abraham is born. The interesting thing I find about that is in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul says on one occasion, God will not leave himself without a witness. And so there's Noah, the righteous one, and his family going down, and then Abraham is born and Noah removes off the scene. And the son of Noah, Shem, he lives until just after Isaac is born. So they were still, Noah and Shem were still living the life ages that was before the flood. But after the flood, they very quickly dropped. Abraham, we're told, lived a long time. I think he was 175 years. And we're told that was a long time. And a lot of his father and that were around that, where before the flood, as we know, 800-900 years was the norm. And so the ages are dropping down to almost what we would consider normal. So they're the sons of Noah down to Abraham. So Abraham's born to a man called Terah, in other words, the father of Abraham. He has 3 sons, Haran, Nahor, and Abraham. Haran is the father of Lot. I'll make a little bit of a mention of Lot. So he's the nephew of Abraham. And by the way things are written in the Bible, we're not given a Lot's life, but I would assume that Haran is a fair amount of years older than Abraham. We're not given very much information on that. And then there's Nahor and then Abraham in that order. So Haran is the father of Lot, and Lot is the father of Ammon and Moab, or the forefather of those countries called Ammon and Moab. The Nahor is the father of a man called Laban, who's the father of Rebekah, and Rebekah marries the son of Abraham, whose name is Isaac. So the sons of Abraham, he goes down to Egypt and he takes a servant girl by the name of Hagar, and eventually, because, and I'm not going into the promises, but God makes promises, but Abraham doesn't have a son. And so he and Sarah say, oh, it looks like you've got to have another wife, so you may as well marry Hagar. So Hagar has a son called Ishmael, and as I've shown there below Ishmael, the nations which we call the Arab nations come from Ishmael. Sarah, and she's been promised she'll have a son. Abraham's been promised many times he'll have a son. Eventually, when Abraham's 100 years old, Isaac is born. Isaac has 2 twin sons, Jacob, from whom the Jews come, or the Israelites, because Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And the twin of Jacob is Esau, from which in the Bible there's a nation called Edom. Edom become known by the time of Christ as Idumeans. So Herod the Great was an Idumean. He wasn't an Israeli. He was an Idumean, descendant therefore of Esau. And then as a nation, they got absorbed into the people around them. And so I've put in brackets that it's quite possible that Edom now is also mixed in with the race that we called Arabs. So, life of Abraham. He's born in Ur of the Chaldees at the head of the Persian Gulf. He travels with his family, his father, to a Haran, which is northwest in Iraq, right in the northwest corner of Iraq. While in Haran, Terah dies. And Genesis 11, verse 32, it says, the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So Terah doesn't leave Haran. Abraham is 75 years old when he leaves Haran and goes down into what we would call the Promised Land, because God promised it to him. And so in chapter 12 of Genesis and verse 4, Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him. So he obeyed what God had said, and Lot went with him, and Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. Now, an interesting thing, if you're interested in making these family trees and that, in Acts chapter 7 and verse 1 to 5, it might pay us to turn that up. Interesting chapter, the book of Acts chapter 7, and it's called at the top of the page here, Stephen's Apology. Stephen was a man who was condemned by the Jewish Jews for virtually saying it's not important whether you're a Jew or not, or whether you're born in the land of Israel. And so he's up on trial, and he was eventually stoned for his words. But in chapter 7, verse 1, the high priest says, Are these things they're saying about you so? And Stephen says, men and brethren and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in, and I called it Haran. Here in the Greek it's called Haran. Just an interesting little side issue. Mesopotamia. Meso means between. And it's used a bit in music and a couple of other things. Meso something or other, and it just means between. And Potamia, we don't often hear that, but the word hippopotamus has the word Potamia in it, and hippopotamus means a river horse. The word Potamia means river. So Mesopotamia is the land between the rivers, River Euphrates and the River Tigris. So God came to Abraham while he's between those rivers, in other words, in Ur of the Chaldees, and said to him, get out of your country, from your kindred or from your family, and come to the land that I will show you. Then when he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran or Charan, and from thence when his father was dead, he removed him into this land wherein ye now dwell. So that's what I've got. Abraham was 75 when his father died, because we're told he entered the land at 75 and his father died at 205. So his father was 130 when Abraham was born, if you do that calculation. Where in Genesis, it just lists off the three sons and says that the father of Terah was 70. So I would assume he was 70 when the eldest one was born, and Abraham is born almost 65 years later. So a little bit of a gap between them. So, I think we can remember three lines. So he goes to the promised land, which we've read in Acts, and the same story in Genesis. Go back to Genesis though, because I'm going to mention some of these towns. I'm just doing the tours of Abraham rather than the promises of Abraham. So in Genesis chapter 12, he leaves. In verse 5, he took Sarai. We could call her name Sarah. Her name was changed. And notice it says Abram. His name was later changed to Abraham. Took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, so the son of Haran, went with him, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten, so that's their servants, as well as Lot may have had children, in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came, and Abraham passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, or Shechem, as it's known in the New Testament, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. And Abraham built an altar, and God appeared to him. And then in verse 8, he went down to Bethel, a place called Bethel, with Bethel on one side and Ai on the other, it says. And then verse 9, he went further south, and because there was a famine, he went down to Egypt. And in chapter 13, verse 1, he went up out of Egypt, he, his wife, all he had, and Lot with him, into the south. And he dwelt, as it says in verse 3, he went to Bethel, where he had been, and then later he went to a place called Hebron, verse 18. He dwelt on the plain of Hebron, which is plain of Mamre, which is Hebron. So I want to So now it's just going to be a show of where he went. Sorry about this. It's my computer. My memory's slow. Its memory's slow. So, I've jumped in halfway. Sorry about that. So there's Australia, and there's India. Across from India is Saudi Arabia. That groove going up the side of Saudi Arabia, hope you know where that is. That groove going up the side is the Persian Gulf. At the head of the Persian Gulf, at the time of Abraham, was Ur of the Chaldees. Now, how can I be so definite? Well, I went there in 1969, and there is actually the remnants of a port in the town which they've excavated of Ur of the Chaldees. There's a... Yeah, there used to be a stick for pulling that down. Yeah, the head of the Gulf is Ur of the Chaldees. And there I've photographed it and written over a smudgy map. And look how far inland it is today. Because one, all the rubbish that's been swept down by the river, and they do claim that the water levels have dropped since those days. So you've got a combination of both. And he left Ur of the Chaldees, and that map's not very good. And actually I've looked at lots of others, and either they show the rivers and don't show much of the town, or vice versa. And so this one doesn't show, but winding up from where it is towards Haran, he virtually followed the river Euphrates, which is quite a large river. That's the river Euphrates, although that's the floods on the side of the river Euphrates. The river Euphrates is actually on the other side of that dark line down through the middle. That's just the flood. So it's a huge flat plain as far as the eye can see, with this river going through the middle of it. I put that one in. At first I didn't. I put it in today. That's a Bedouin tent, and there's all their cattle and sheep and goats and that. And that's what it would have looked like when Abraham was travelling. Wouldn't have been any different. So on this huge flat expanse, and they're wandering up the side of the river, heading up to Haran. That is Ur of the Chaldees itself. It's been excavated, and they call that a ziggurat, but a lot of the people, when you talk to them that know anything about this, say that these ziggurats were all over the place back in those days. It's some in Babylon, and they're supposed to be a miniature of what the Tower of Babel looked like, except this is only one layer. The original would have had 4 layers. So it's quite a high tower, and each layer was built on with dirt in the middle, they worked out, except the top layer, which was hollow and a temple. And that's the view from the top, and that's the ruins, or part of the ruins, because that's in the middle of the excavations, which would have been Ur. So you've got a town, and then it's just flat. Huge flat plain. Can't see much, but if I can see it, yeah. Which one do you press?
At the bottom.
There.
No.
Yeah.
That one.
Yep. Yeah, so there we are. So up here is where Ur would have been, at the junction of those 2 rivers, and then he walks up this river here. So at the moment we're still looking around Ur, and then he goes up to right up the top corner of that map. And we didn't go up to Haran, but that's a view from the plain, looking down at the flooded river. And it just, to me, it gives the whole concept, one, of how big it was, the river itself when it was in flood, but the other thing is the countryside. There's nothing. It's like a photograph of beach. There's no colour, because there's nothing. It's just flat plain as far as the eye can see.
It's not green either.
What's that?
It's not green either.
No. So he's in Haran, and then he's told, leave Haran and go down to the promised land. We're told he picked up a servant as he went through Damascus. And this is actually just south. That's actually what they call the anti-Lebanese range, and around the area what they call Mount Hermon, which is right at the north of Israel, but it's on the Syrian side, coming into Syria. So quite a mountainous area. And we're actually over the town of Damascus, or the city of Damascus, which is one of the oldest cities in the world. And it's in part of what they call the Lebanese range, which in winter gets snow on it. And it's those snows which melt that form the rivers of Syria and the River Jordan. It says that he went down and he went to Shechem. Shechem is in northern Israel, and that's actually quite interesting because Shechem became a place of blessing and cursing in Israel, and the Israelites had to go on either side on two mountains. And so that's how I can be quite sure that it's at Shechem. There's another view from actually the other side. This one is from the west looking east, and the other one was from the east looking west. And then he went down from Shechem and he went to a place having Bethel and Ai, and this is near that area of Bethel. So it's in what they call the mountains of Judea. So quite green countryside, capable of having crops, or in those days, because they didn't have fences and that, he would be able to graze his animals, and possibly there would be natural fruit trees. Like the fig tree is a native of Israel, and there's quite a few other trees that come from that area. And that's as you go further east towards the River Jordan, and it becomes a little bit rockier and drier. And again, some Bedouins in the background. And again, in that similar area. Now, Abraham didn't go on a plane, I can assure you. But that curvature is the northeast side of Egypt. If the photo was a little bit clearer, you would be able to see, but you can't with this one.
The Mediterranean Sea?
That's the Mediterranean Sea, but you would be able to see what now is the Suez Canal. But it's somewhere under those fine clouds. I can remember even taking the photo and thinking it would come out, but I've never been able to see it. Now, Egypt wasn't built up like that, but Egypt is built on the River Nile. And I forget the name of the town that was the capital of Egypt back in those days, because that's Cairo today. Sorry, what was that?
Was it Memphis?
Yeah, Memphis, and there's another name. There's two. Heliopolis, which means the city of the sun, because they worship the sun. And at the time of a few years, about 200 or 300 years, when Israel went down into Egypt, they made bricks and out of straw, and this is on this side is a brick kiln. Where is it? There. Yeah, that's a brick kiln, and they made bricks out of clay and straw. and they were doing it when we were there. The Sphinx of Egypt, and near Giza, where the pyramids are, the 3 large pyramids there, there's a closer up view of the Great Pyramid. And the Sphinx with the pyramid just close on this side. That's interesting. That's 1969. That man's watering his crops. So he's got this big bar thing here with a rope with a bucket. He lowers that into that canal, which is fed out of the river, and then tips that into a little channel that he's dug, and it winds down amongst that grass and goes to a field where he's trying to water. So that's in 1969. They had a similar system, and when Israel were taken out of Egypt, which is about 400-500 years after the time of Abraham, God says, you will not, when you go to Israel, water the land with your foot. So what they would do is tip it into like a little reservoir thing and then kick the dirt out and make it go where they want it. They'd have these little channels. They'd just kick the dirt out and make it go where they wanted through a channel. He then left Egypt, and it says he went up into the south of Israel, and then he went to Hebron, and that's the city of Hebron today. And it says that Hebron is in the plain of Mamre, and so just outside of Hebron today there are olive yards and vineyards going through from that area. Oh, this one's out of order. Yeah, we're back in Egypt, sorry. What we've got here is some cows going around with some wood tied between them. And as they go around, there's a wheel that you can just see the top of there, and that whitish gushing stuff is water coming out of that wheel. So the wheel dips down in the water which comes in, and then as it comes up, the water gushes out of that hole into a channel that's built there, and that channel then feeds into the water that's in front of me here. And then that, because it's up high, will then flow around the farmers' paddocks. That's 1969 technology in Egypt. Right, so have you got your computer or?
Oh, that's right.
So turn the computer off.
Thank you. All right, so we've seen the Abraham and a lot of movements. So next week there's going to be a bit more in-depth look at the promises. But you can see in your notes there, this section starts with the promises, and they get added to next week as well. But so one of the things that, I guess from a spiritual point of view, Abraham's been called to leave Ur. Similar to Cain and Abel, when Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden, it's like they were leaving God behind, like they're walking away. And particularly Cain, when he's punished, he's sent away. So it's as if he's walking away from God. And in this case, it's almost the other way around. So Abraham, Ur, is actually known for being a massive, was one of the centres of civilization, but also it was a very idolatrous place. So a lot of archaeology have found a lot of like idols and things like that. So there was many different gods, very similar to in Egypt, where they have a god for everything. Ur was known for being much the same. So that's what God was actually calling Abraham away from. So he's calling him away from worshipping these just idols, which are just man-made, stone and rock and wood and things like that. So God's actually calling Abraham to something better. And so that's what we're going to look at now in chapter 12. So God gives Abraham an actual promise. So it seems that if you look at chapter 12, verse 1, so I've just got this translation here, says, the Lord had said to Abram. So it's as if when they had left, this is what God had told him. So if we'll just read verse 2 and 3. So in my translation here it says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you. And whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So there's a couple of very specific things God says to Abraham there. And today, we're some thousands of years later, I think most people on this earth would have heard the name Abraham. At least people that probably read a little bit would have heard of Abraham. So in some ways, Abraham, even though he was thousands of years ago, his name still exists as a known name. So it wouldn't be too many people from the time of Abraham that people of today would know who they were. So, yeah.
There was an agreement between Israel and a couple of Arab countries, the Abrahamic Accord.
Yeah, that's right. Did you hear all that? So just recently, Israel and a number of the Arab nations had a pact or an agreement, and they called it the Abrahamic Accord, because they're trying to find some common ground, and the common ground is that their ancestor was Abraham. So that's pretty substantial, I guess, historical event that the Arabs and the Jews are actually working together because they have common enemies now instead of looking at each other as enemies. It's amazing just the fact that they called it the Abrahamic covenant. It was Abrahamic Accord, sorry, not covenant. So verse 2 there. So the first one is specifically to Abraham. It says, of you I will make you into a great nation. So if we divide these promises just in this verse, or two verses here, into four categories, and it should be in the notes, is one is Abraham himself will be known as a national symbol. So, and just that example then, there's people today who can go back to Abraham and say, we came from Abraham, and there's many nations. So if we said the Arab nations, they're made up of a lot of different countries. And the Jews as well, the Israelites, they go back to Abraham as well. So just that point there, from Abraham would become a great nation. And specifically this one would be the nation of Israel itself, coming from Abraham. So it's a great nation, so it's specifically an individual nation there. The next one there is a personal promise to Abraham. So God isn't just saying, okay, so one day in the future from you will become a great nation. There's a specific one to himself, Abraham himself. It says, I will bless you and I will make your name great. So as I was just saying, many people now know the name Abraham. So just in that itself, that has come to pass. So that's the personal promise to Abraham. And then the third one is the beginning of verse 3. I'll bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. So here is a promise to Abraham that he and his descendants would be looked after. And a good one on that is, I guess, anyone that's tried to destroy the Jews, as we know has happened, attempted many times, ends up backfiring on those people. So here, this one here I've got in my little notes here, that's a family promise to Abraham. So his descendants would be blessed and looked after. And then the fourth point of that one there is actually how we all come into it, because I'm not sure if any of us are descendants of Abraham, but it says all peoples. Some translations say all families, but the Hebrew word there really is about nations. So all tribes, I think some translations say as well, all tribes on earth will be blessed through Abraham. So because of Abraham, the promise that God's giving him, all people on this earth will actually have the opportunity to be blessed with Abraham. So there's there's one for Abraham himself, there's a national promise there to the nation of Israel. There's one to his family of direct descendants, and then also linking in everyone to that. So there's quite an interesting little couple of simple verses, but it has quite a wide ranging effect on all of us. If we then come down to verse 7, so as Ern mentioned, so Abraham's now he's travelled, they've left Haran behind, so his father had died. They're now moved down into what would be called the Promised Land, so the land of the Canaan, where the Canaanites lived. There's all different sorts of people living there. And he's at this place in verse 6 in Shechem. And God again appears to him and gives him, he sort of adds to the promise a little bit. He says to Abraham in verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So before he was in a different land and he said, I will give you certain promises. Now Abraham has travelled down into that land and he's saying, this is the land that I'm going to give to your offspring. So as Ern mentioned, Abraham didn't even have any children at this stage, even though he was getting older as well. He didn't have any children, and yet God's telling him, the land that you're currently standing on is where I will give, is the exact land I'll give your descendants. So as Ern mentioned as well, so Shechem is in the northern parts of Palestine, or where Israel is today. It's up north. And so then in the end of verse 7, Abraham builds an altar. So that's a response. So Abraham responds, and I guess I skipped that as well. Abraham, you think about that. If someone told you, I need you to leave your family behind, because there would have been more family than just the ones that went with Abraham. I want you to leave your city, I want to leave your family, and I want you to go somewhere else. That's what Abraham did. He responded to that. He obviously could see there was something in what God was telling him to do. There was something much more important than where he was. So he and his family had left they'd gone to Haran, and now he's travelled down, at the request of God, he's travelled down into what would become the Promised Land. So he responds again at the end of verse 7. So I guess here is the word, is his faith is being shown, his belief in God, because he responds by building an altar, and that is a symbol of being humble and being thankful. So then in verse 8, he travels onwards to the hills, as mentioned before, between Bethel and Ai, then down into the Negev, which is right down south and further into Egypt. So one of the points about Abraham is, while this is promised to him, it's not his to take at that time. So Abraham is a pilgrim and a stranger in this place, so he's constantly travelling. So while he walks through it and he sees it, it's not actually his to take at that time. And I think he seems to really understand that, as we'll have a bit of a look at with Lot in a few moments. So the end of chapter 12 then goes through the incident. They're down in Egypt, and then they eventually come back. We don't need to really go into all the detail there. But basically, Abraham tells Sarah, his wife, or Sarai, his wife, to pretend that she's his sister, which she actually was his half-sister anyway, because he was afraid that because she was so beautiful that they would kill him to take her as his wife. Ends up Pharaoh, in verse 18, he summons Abraham and says, what have you done? You've tricked me, and actually gives him a number of things so that they would leave in verse 20. So Pharaoh gave orders about Abraham and his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So they said, you've brought some, I think it was a plague on them at that time. I'm trying to remember now. But yeah, so basically they left Egypt and they travelled back into the actual Promised Land. So back to where Abraham should have been, which is back in that land. We see there again in verse 3 of chapter 13, and it says there, from the Negev. So the Negev is the very south of Israel, and going purely on memory, Negev I think just means south, but it's a very dry area. And one of the, later on, I'm not sure if you remember the person Caleb, Joshua and Caleb were the spies that went and gave the good report. He gives that area, one of those areas, to his daughter, and she complains because there's no water there. So it's a very dry area. She asks for a different section so she can have some wells to actually try and water it, much like they were trying to do in some of those pictures. So it's a very dry area, and it still is today. It's a very dry place. So he travels from there back up. So if you look at chapter 13, verse 3, and it shows how Abraham lived in this verse. It says there, from Negev, so the south, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier. So he's constantly travelling. He's not staying still. He's not setting his roots down. He's not building. He's just travelling in his tent, and he's got a lot of people with him, even though he doesn't have any children. Verse 2 said he had become very wealthy in livestock and silver and gold. And his nephews with him, Lot, as well, and he also had a lot of cattle. And so they're both travelling together with all their sheep, goats and cattle. And verse 4, it says there, this is talking about where he had built the altar. So he's travelled around the area and travelled back up to that area of Bethel. Now verse 5 and 6, it talks about how they were moving with their flocks and their herds and their tents. But in verse 6, the land couldn't hold them. There were so many of them that they actually were, the men that were looking after the animals were actually starting to quarrel and fight over, no, this is the land that we were supposed to be feeding, and you go over there, or something like that. There was so many of them that they actually didn't have enough room. So verse 6 says, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for the possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. Verse 7, quarrelling arose between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot. And it also says that the Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at the time. So there's already people living in the land, and they've come through with so many animals that they actually didn't fit. So in the next few verses, Abraham says, okay, I need to solve this. This is Lot, my nephew. I don't want to fight with him. Obviously his family, so I'll give him a choice. So verse 8, Abraham says to Lot, let's not have any quarrelling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? So Abraham sort of tells him to look out. There's a whole lot of land there. He says, let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. So remembering Abraham was the one that this land was promised to, not Lot. It's promised to Abraham, and yet Abraham's willing to take the seconds here, I guess. He says to Lot, you have first choice, and I'll have second choice. Now, where they actually are is actually quite reasonably high up, and you could see down towards the Jordan Valley. So that's exactly what Lot does in verse 10. In this translation it says, Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt towards Zoar. So he's looking around and he can see Bethel, it's dry, it's not quite as green, but he remembers back in Egypt, like here, where they were able to pump water and move water around. He looks down where the river Jordan's flowing through, and that is green, lush, and he says, yeah, that's where I want to go, that's the easier way. So verse 11, Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan, set out toward the east, and the two men parted. So Abraham was willing to take the other option, which was stay where they are, and in that area, which would have been drier, but he was willing to let Lot have the choice. And it sort of shows Abraham's character in here, where he knows this land isn't his to take right now, so he's willing to keep moving and to be that pilgrim or that stranger in that land. And obviously, unfortunately for Lot, it says in verse 13 that now the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. So unfortunately, that's where Lot went towards, whereas Abraham stayed in this area of Bethel for now. So here in verse 14 through to 17, God then appears to him again and adds to his the promises that he'd given him earlier. So as the chapters go through, and God willing next week you will see this again, is God gives him a message, and then because Abraham responds, God adds to it. So then and Abraham responds again, and then God adds to that promise or adds more detail to it. So to build Abraham's faith and belief in it. So if you look at verse 14, and we'll finish end of this chapter, so it won't be too much longer. It says there, the Lord said to Abraham after Lot had parted from him. So it almost seemed as if that decision that Abraham had made to stay there was the right one. So God says to him there, lift up your eyes from where you are. It says, look north, south, east and west. It says, all the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. So there's a little addition there, isn't it, of a time frame, which is a massive time frame, which is forever. But it says, look north, south, east, west. So everywhere you can see Abraham, or Abram as he is now at this point, everything that you can see is yours. And Abraham is pretty much in the centre of that land of Israel at this time. And how much he could see, I'm not sure, whether he had been given the eye of the Spirit by God to be able to see further, or... Sorry? No pollution, that's right, yeah. Nice clear day, hopefully. And so basically, the point is, though, that if you stood on a hill, if we went up to Mount Lofty on a really nice clear day, you can see a long way. And if we were told that everything you can see will belong to you and your family forever, it's a pretty amazing promise, really, isn't it? So
You could possibly see the southern end of the Dead Sea, and yet he would have been about 40, 50 kilometres north of the top end, but there's a ridge of mountains where he is.
Yeah, okay, yep.
He could see the tops of the mountains around Jerusalem, and then he would be able to look up almost to the Sea of Galilee, and from where he was, he'd see Mount Carmel going out to the sea.
Yep.
There's a bit of a trough between him and Mount Carmel.
Yep.
So he can see about 3/4 of that land. But the other thing is, as it said before, walk through the land.
Yes.
He'd already walked through a fair bit of the land. So he'd already seen quite a lot.
Yeah, that's right. It's a good point, because if you were told, walk between here to Victor Harbour and I'll give everything of that to you, and you walking it would be a far different experience, thinking this is going to belong to my descendants. You'd be sort of taking it in, or as opposed to just walking there to get to Victor Harbour. So, and that's what Abraham obviously did, like walked it, realising that it would belong to him and his descendants. And I'm not sure if you've ever been out right out north, like Flinders Ranges and things like that. If you go up on some of those hills or mountains, you can actually see a really long way. I was amazed. We were up there a few years ago. I think you might have been there with us, John. And there was actually a house on the side of the mountain ranges, and from their porch, you're looking back across the top of the Gulf. You can see the peninsula on the other side and the mountains on the other side of the Gulf. And on a clear day, they said, yeah, you can see it clear as day across the other side. Whereas obviously when the sea breeze comes in with a bit of fog, obviously blurs it. But it is amazing how much you can see once you get up above the common man's sight, I guess. Yeah, and so as Ern just said, in verse 17, he's told, verse 16, he says, I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. So if he's looking at the land, and then he's saying, now your descendants will be, if you can grab a handful of dust and count that, that is how much your descendants will be. So that's basically, you're not innumerable is the point there, isn't it? His descendants, and if you looked at all the people that have come from Abraham since that time, I don't think we could count it. But the point is, he's going to become a great nation, many people. So then verse 17, as Ern said, go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So from here, Abraham would have been walking through it and travelling like a stranger, like the Bedouins in one of the other pictures, who never set root down. They're constantly on the move. That's what Abraham was like. And verse 18 then says, so Abraham moved his tent and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built another altar to the Lord. So Hebron's a bit further back south and in the hill range of that area there. And that, again, shows his response as he builds another altar. So an altar is like a place of worship or a sacrifice. So we can see there, just quite quickly, I guess, is some promises God's given to Abraham. So he's given him a message to leave what would have been comfortable, his old city, a place of idolatry. Abraham responded by doing that. So God gave him some actual promises. Abraham responded again and God added to the promises. Again, Abraham responded, and that is the pattern. So Abraham responds to God's message and promises that he gives him. And so God willing, next week, chapters 14 and 15, in chapter 15 itself, there's a lot more added to the promise once again. So I'll hand back to Ern to finish, seeing it's just after 8:30. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Shem. As Shem said, next week we'll be looking at chapters 14, 15 and maybe 16, looking at the events that went on in the country while Abraham was there, some wars, and how God used opportunity amongst those things to give extra promises to Abraham, and also the beginning of the Arabs through Ishmael. So, thank you for coming, and we'll now close with prayer. Our Father, we thank Thee for Thy guidance and care. We thank You, Heavenly Father, for Your word of truth, that we can look at events which occurred thousands of years ago, and of people who obeyed Your words, people who went out, walking not knowing where they were going, because You had told them and You have promised them things. And they believed You, Heavenly Father, and obeyed in faith. And as they were given promises, so we also are told that we can be the seed of Abraham, his offspring, and receive of those promises, which is a position in Thy kingdom, even the promised land. Be with us and guide us, we pray, as we leave this place, that if Your Son has not returned, we can come again and discuss Thy word. We thank You for all Your blessings, for food, for clothing and shelter, and give unto Thee all praise and honour through Your Son, even Jesus the Christ. Amen.